restrictions that go on is a somewhat unique American experience. Would you speak to that issue?
One of the things I always point out to people who talk about the grid is it would be so nice if we could do what Eisenhower did with the highway system. Eisenhower is responsible for the interstates, and what he said was that this is a national defense highway system. That gave the feds the ultimate authority to overrule the states on routing. We don't do that with power lines. There are a zillion regulators, all of whom have to give permission along the way. And the only thing that takes longer to build in the U.S. than a nuclear power plant is a high-voltage transmission line. But that's not the only problem with wind. The wind people are hiding a problem, and I wish they'd talk about it more honestly. As we all know, the wind doesn't blow all the time. It blows sometimes, it doesn't blow other times. The wind blows most strongly at night when we need the least power, and it blows most weakly in the daytime when we need the most power. It's strongest in the winter, spring, and fall, and weakest in the summer when our demand is high. And it's very variable, and there's a real problem with wind power, and that is how to handle its intermittent nature. They call it in the business firming the power source. So if the wind stops blowing, what do? Do I shut down all the businesses? Do I turn off the lights in the university? I try and get another source of electricity, and what I get is electricity generally from standby natural gas power plants, because they can start and stop fast. But because they're not running all the time, the electricity from those things is very expensive. And we've set up a system where the people who build wind farms get paid for their electricity, and they're not responsible for making up for it when the wind doesn't blow. All of us pay for the high-priced electricity that has to be used to firm the system up. And if you try and get the numbers out of our Public Utilities Commission, they won't tell you. I know because I tried. But it's a serious problem, and it is the technological hole in the renewables, this business of large-scale energy storage. How can I do it? There are no giant batteries that can do the kind of scale that we're talking about. A lot of people are working on technologies, and there's nothing there yet that's broadly applicable. The best thing we've got is called pump storage. If you've got a river and a dam and a pond, you can pump water back uphill when the wind is blowing and run it back downhill through the turbines when you need it. So that's a way to take the variable wind and pump it uphill when it's blowing and run it downhill when you need it and smooth these variations out. The problem is that there aren't that many places which have rivers, big drops, ponds at the bottom, and where you can pump it up and downhill. So that's not a really good one. Another problem is that wind is highly correlated. You talked about the Great Plains. That's where the best wind in the United States is. One of my colleagues at Stanford, Mark Jacobson, is one of the country's winds experts, and he did an analysis saying, suppose I build a distributed system all over the Great Plains. He put in, let's see, I think it was 250,000 square miles with wind farms spotted on it. Single wind farm, you got an average of 33% of capacity out. Hooking up over the whole area, you got 36% of capacity. That's because the wind in the Great Plains comes whistling down from Canada And if it stops blowing one place, it's going to stop blowing most places. So this is a big problem. It's being worked on. The solution isn't there yet. And I think we really need to put a little more effort in that one.
And about the sun, if you don't get the wind yet, has the sun been better to us as a source of energy?
The sun has got a nice feature, and that is that it shines in the daytime. It's got a not so nice feature that it doesn't shine at night. But if you look at when our peak demand is in the daytime. If you look seasonally, our peak demand is in the summer in the daytime. So the sun, although it's very variable, it shines in the day, and it's best in the summertime. And so smoothing out the solar is easier than smoothing out the wind.
Some of us have bought that argument many, many decades ago. I built a house over in the East Bay, and I put solar panels on the roof. I was the proudest man on the top of Montclair because I was modern, and they were old-fashioned. But I'm surrounded by Douglas fir and other big trees that constantly get in the way of the sun. But I have noted that it helped, and so the government also gave me a big discount on doing it on my taxes. So I love the government that week when they gave me the discount.
Well, I don't know when you did that. My wife and I did it more than 20 years ago, but not for electricity. What we did was for heat and hot water.
Yeah.
So we had a system on the roof, and we had an 800-gallon water tank. And what you did was you heated up the water in that tank, and then when you wanted domestic hot water, it circulated through a coil in that tank. If you wanted heat for the house, we had one of these radiant heating systems where hot water circulates under the floor. You'd circulate the water, and it would warm the house. And the big water tank was the buffer for cloudy days. It would handle the system for 2 or 3 days, even if the sun stopped shining. And the sun never stopped shining entirely. What happens on cloudy days is it gets diffuse, and you only get about 30% of the energy that you would on a sunny day. That's an old technology, and one of the things that's always baffled me about California is there's this huge push for solar photovoltaics when if you care about emissions from fossil fuels like the gas used in most heating, why don't you give a lot of push and a lot of credit to solar heat and hot water?
I know certain governments do that. For instance, if you ever go to Israel, you will notice that it's been a big push of the Israelis for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And so everywhere I go, there's one of those tanks here or there. And in the Baltic area, it's interesting because friends of mine in the audience, Jim Rosenthal and his wife, travel there. And now if you go along the coast of Denmark and northern Germany, they have their wind machines right out into the Baltic. You just see them marching out there like a Prussian army, one after the other for miles and miles and miles, trying to tap a little bit, not much, but a little bit, as another way of doing things. Obviously, the Baltic world is not a very sunny world, as is Southern California. So each and every way, government can, I think, do a little bit if you have some ability to send a signal to the public that this would be wise financially. It's no use preaching to them, but if you say to me, this will save you on your tax bill, I'm signing up right away.
I think you're worrying about the wrong problem.
Okay.
The problem is the growth of the developing world. That is where economic activity is increasing most rapidly. That's where the projections of where the biggest increase in energy demand is going to come from. The industrialized world, the projections from now till the end of the century say things are not going to change very much, but the developing world, they are going to change. And now if you're talking about the developing world, think of what this stuff costs. When you play games with wind farms that are inefficient and don't give you a lot of energy per buck, you're pushing a technology that is not going to be adopted by the people who are trying to raise their populations from poverty to some sort of reasonable standard of living. And I think that we have to be working much harder on technologies that are affordable to the most rapidly growing sections of the world. The best thing that's happened on climate change is that the Chinese have discovered they got a lot of shale gas. And with a lot of shale gas, they're not going to have to produce so many coal-fired power plants. And with less coal-fired power plants, they're not only going to emit less greenhouse gases, but they're going to emit less pollution that's going to harm the health of their population. So I think that if you look at all the projections, by 2100, what we now call the developing world is going to be using 3 times as much energy as what we now call the industrialized world. So if the only thing you do is do things that the industrialized world can afford to do, you're going to be left with virtually the same problem that you've got now. And so one needs to look at how you're going to engineer a transition, and it's a lot easier to engineer it when people are building new things all the time. We've got a system that's out there now, and our energy demand is going to grow, but very slowly. So if we want to do a lot, we have to change what we already have. Okay, that's not so easy. If they need to do a lot, you have to give them the technology that they can install. Now, wind. If we could ever solve the storage problem, you could do a lot more for wind in China than you're going to do in the Baltic, because China is a much bigger economy. It's got a lot more people. So when you're thinking about this problem, don't just think about us. If you're thinking about us, you're just thinking about our own problems, and you're not thinking about the worldwide issues. Our problems are serious problems. I started to try and talk about energy in a new way, and I need a better title than the one I'm tentatively using. It's called Energy in 3 Dimensions. And what are the dimensions? The dimensions are the economy, the national security, and the environment, all 3. And if you think in all 3, you may come up with different answers than if you just think in one. You also have an interesting way of bringing the non-believers. You started talking about climate change. We have non-believers here in the United States, maybe even some in the audience, I don't know. But if you look at what happened with the 54 mile per gallon rule for cars, what it's going to do is it will reduce the amount of gasoline needed for light vehicles by a factor of 2. It will reduce the balance of payment deficit by $200 billion a year. And by the way, it will reduce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions too. You haven't heard Senator Inhofe, who was one of the non-believers, say, no, all this miles per gallon is nonsense. It's not nonsense, but it's not nonsense to him because of the economic benefits and the national security benefits. We don't have to spend so much money defending the Persian Gulf. Equally, when you talk about energy in the rapidly developing countries, they know exactly the same problem is coming up. And you see China, which has huge reserves of money, a lot of